In the summer of 1944, the war in Eastern Europe entered a decisive stage. Following the Red Army's victories in Ukraine and the successful advance toward the Carpathian Mountains, attention turned to Transylvania, a region of deep historical, cultural, and strategic importance. Northern Transylvania, in particular, had been transferred from Romania to Hungary under the Second Vienna Award of August 1940, a decision imposed by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. For 4 years, this arrangement had created political tension and mutual resentment between Hungary and Romania, each claiming historical and ethnic rights to the land. The population itself was divided, with ethnic Hungarians and Romanians living side by side, both communities subjected to military rule, shifting borders, and competing propaganda. By mid-1944, the situation was further complicated by Romania's political realignment. On 23 August, King Michael I led a coup against Marshal Ion Antonescu, the country's authoritarian leader who had tied Romania's fate to Nazi Germany. The new Romanian government declared an armistice with the Allies and ordered its armed forces to join the Soviet Union in fighting against German and Hungarian troops. This sudden reversal transformed Romania from a German ally into a battlefield for the Axis retreat. For the Soviets, Romania's defection was a significant breakthrough. It opened a pathway into Central Europe, provided access to vital oil resources, and weakened Germany's southern flank. The Germans, however, were determined not to yield Northern Transylvania without resistance. The region represented not only strategic ground along the approaches to Hungary, but also a political symbol. The German High Command, together with Hungarian authorities, regarded the defense of Transylvania as essential to maintaining Axis cohesion in Central Europe. Hungarian troops, many of them recruited from local populations, were ordered to resist the combined Romanian and Soviet forces. This set the stage for one of the most complex confrontations of the war in southeastern Europe. Romanian soldiers, who had fought alongside the Wehrmacht until only weeks earlier, now found themselves attacking German and Hungarian positions under Soviet command. Military readiness across the front was uneven. The Red Army had committed significant formations, including elements of the 2nd and 4th Ukrainian Fronts, which together numbered hundreds of thousands of troops with armored artillery and air support. Romanian units, restructured and reoriented after the coup, contributed divisions eager to reclaim territories lost in 1940, but strained by the logistical challenges of sudden redeployment. On the Axis side, the German 8th Army and Hungarian 2nd Army were under pressure from the rapid Soviet advance. Many units were understrength, relying on fortified positions, local terrain advantages, and a network of defensive lines along rivers and mountain passes to slow the offensive. Civilian populations, caught between advancing and retreating armies, braced for upheaval. Villages across northern Transylvania prepared for requisitions, evacuations, and reprisals, uncertain which flag would be raised in the coming weeks. For some, the prospect of Romanian and Soviet forces returning offered the hope of reunification with Bucharest, while for others, particularly Hungarian communities, it represented the fear of losing autonomy and facing reprisals. The fragile coexistence of ethnic groups was strained by years of political division, and now faced the immediate realities of frontline warfare. Intelligence assessments in Berlin, Budapest, and Moscow all underscored the importance of the coming battles. German planners sought to hold the Carpathians and prevent a Soviet breakthrough into the Hungarian plain. Hungarian authorities hoped to demonstrate loyalty to the Axis and preserve territorial claims. Soviet leadership viewed the campaign as part of a broader push toward Budapest, Vienna, and ultimately Berlin. Romanian leaders, newly aligned with the Allies, sought to prove their commitment while reclaiming disputed lands. The convergence of these aims meant that the battles around Cluj and other centers in northern Transylvania would be fought with intensity, shaped by politics as much as by military strategy. In early September 1944, the Soviet 2nd and 4th Ukrainian Fronts began their coordinated advance into Transylvania. Their immediate objective was to secure crossing points over the Mureș and Someș rivers, and to establish a firm line of advance toward the city of Cluj, the administrative and symbolic center of northern Transylvania. Alongside them, Romanian units, reorganized after the August coup, joined the offensive. The Romanian Fourth Army, under General Gheorghe Avramescu, fielded multiple infantry divisions, while the Romanian First Army, reactivated under Soviet supervision, prepared to move into action further west. These formations operated under Soviet operational command, but maintained national structures, creating a complex chain of coordination that reflected both cooperation and underlying mistrust. On the Axis side, the German Eighth Army under General Otto Wöhler was tasked with holding the line. Reinforced by the Hungarian Second Army, commanded by General Lajos Veres von Dalnoki, their mission was to delay the Soviet and Romanian advance long enough to stabilize the front along the natural barrier of the Carpathians. Approximately 12,000 German and Hungarian troops, supported by armored divisions and artillery units, were deployed in a series of defensive positions. Their numbers contrasted with the combined Soviet and Romanian force of more than 2,000 soldiers, backed by over 1,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, as well as strong air support from the Soviet Fifth Air Army. The opening engagements were characterized by rapid maneuvers and attempts to seize key transportation hubs. The Axis command identified Cluj, Târgu Mureș, and Turda as crucial defensive points, with railways and highways serving as lifelines for supplies and reinforcements. Soviet planners sought to bypass heavily fortified zones and to exploit gaps in the enemy's lines. Romanian units, familiar with the terrain and motivated by the prospect of reclaiming lost territories, were often placed in spearhead roles, though their equipment was generally less modern than that of Soviet formations. Civilian populations in towns such as Aiud, Turda, and Cluj witnessed the sudden shift from Hungarian to Romanian and Soviet administration, often within days. The Hungarian government encouraged local defense efforts, mobilizing reservists and paramilitary groups, while Romanian authorities sought to establish order in areas under their control. The resulting clashes of authority added uncertainty for the inhabitants, many of whom faced requisitions, evacuations, and bombardments. Rail stations and road junctions became scenes of chaos as refugees attempted to flee approaching front lines. Commanders on both sides faced immediate difficulties. For the Axis, communication and coordination between German and Hungarian units were strained. German officers frequently questioned the combat readiness of their Hungarian allies, while Hungarian leaders emphasized the political stakes of defending Northern Transylvania. For the Soviet and Romanian side, the challenge was to synchronize advances across multiple armies with differing levels of training and equipment, while ensuring supply lines stretched across the Carpathians remained functional. In many cases, roads became clogged with military convoys, while poor weather conditions slowed movement and hampered air support. By mid-September, the pattern of battle was set. Axis troops entrenched around Cluj and Turda attempted to hold back repeated Soviet and Romanian offensives. The attackers, superior in numbers and firepower, sought to encircle these positions, but the defenders used the hilly terrain and urban strongpoints to delay the advance. The opening phase of the campaign thus became a contest of attrition, the Axis trying to buy time for an orderly retreat toward Hungary, the Allies determined to secure Transylvania swiftly as a gateway to Central Europe. The strategic calculations of September 1944 were shaped by the ambitions and limitations of all sides engaged in the Transylvanian campaign. For the Soviet Union, the primary objective was to secure a continuous front line extending from the Black Sea through Romania and into Hungary. This would allow the Red Army to launch subsequent offensives aimed directly at Budapest and, eventually, Vienna. Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, commanding the Second Ukrainian Front, and Marshal Fyodor Tolbukin of the Fourth Ukrainian Front were tasked with breaking through Axis defenses in northern Transylvania. Their planning emphasized overwhelming force at key junctions, with tank and mechanized corps spearheading assaults supported by concentrated artillery barrages and airstrikes. Logistics, however, remained a challenge. Fuel, ammunition, and food supplies had to be transported across the Carpathians on overburdened road and rail networks, often vulnerable to sabotage or aerial attack. Romania's strategic goals were layered and politically sensitive. Having switched sides on 23 August, its leadership sought to demonstrate loyalty to the Allied cause by actively contributing troops to the campaign. The Romanian Fourth Army was integrated into Soviet plans, but its divisions were understrength, often equipped with outdated artillery and light tanks. Still, Romanian commanders argued for active participation to ensure their claims to Northern Transylvania would be recognized at the post-war settlement. The political leadership in Bucharest, meanwhile, faced pressure from both Moscow and London to maintain stability within Romania itself while committing large forces to the front. King Michael and his government viewed the liberation of Cluj and other cities not only as a military necessity, but also as a means of consolidating national prestige. For Germany, the situation was dire, yet not hopeless. Adolf Hitler had ordered that Transylvania, and especially Cluj, be defended to the last possible moment. He regarded the region as vital for two reasons. It shielded Hungary, a key Axis ally, and it delayed Soviet access to Central Europe. German commanders, including General Otto Wöhler of the Eighth Army, devised plans to hold defensive belts along the Someș River and around urban centers. Their forces relied heavily on artillery, panzer divisions, and mobile reserves that could counterattack exposed Soviet flanks. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, attempted to contest Soviet air superiority with fighter and bomber units based in Hungary. Supplies, however, were scarce, and reinforcements were limited due to the simultaneous collapse of the front in Poland and the Balkans. Hungary's objectives were shaped by both political desperation and military necessity. The government of Regent Miklós Horthy hoped to retain control over Northern Transylvania, awarded in 1940, to bolster domestic legitimacy. The Hungarian Second Army, though diminished after losses on the Eastern Front, was redeployed to defend its territory. Hungarian commanders emphasized fortification of cities and use of local militia to support regular troops. Yet the integration of Hungarian units into German operational planning created tension, as German officers often doubted their reliability. Still, Hungarian forces fought tenaciously in defensive positions, aware that the loss of Northern Transylvania would weaken Hungary's bargaining position, both with Berlin and, potentially, with the Allies. Civilian populations bore witness to the convergence of these strategic calculations. In Cluj, local administrations prepared for possible sieges by stockpiling food and medical supplies, while underground political groups speculated about the outcome of the war. Romanian communities anticipated reintegration with Bucharest, but worried about reprisals during the transition. Hungarian communities feared the consequences of defeat, particularly property confiscations or population transfers. Propaganda on both sides intensified. Soviet leaflets promised liberation. German broadcasts urged resistance, and local newspapers conveyed shifting narratives depending on which authority was in control. As September drew on, each command faced growing pressure. The Soviets and Romanians needed quick victories to sustain momentum. The Germans and Hungarians aimed to delay and bleed the attackers. Miscalculations became evident. Soviet intelligence underestimated the defensive strength of Axis positions around Turda, while German command overestimated its capacity to hold extended front lines. Romanian divisions, though motivated, struggled with coordination and sometimes advanced too far without adequate Soviet support, exposing them to counterattacks. These divergent aims and logistical constraints set the stage for the next phase of the campaign, where battles of increasing scale and intensity would decide the fate of Northern Transylvania. The first major engagements in Northern Transylvania began in the second half of September 1944. The Soviet Second Ukrainian Front, supported by Romanian units, pushed westward along the Mureș and Someș valleys, meeting strong resistance from entrenched German and Hungarian formations. One of the earliest clashes occurred near Turda, a town located at a critical junction of roads and railways. Axis forces recognized its importance as a defensive anchor for Cluj, while the Soviets identified it as a gateway to the interior of Transylvania. On 13 September, forward Soviet detachments attempted to enter the town, but were repelled by concentrated artillery fire and counterattacks from German armored elements, including detachments of the 23rd Panzer Division. The battle for Turda soon escalated into a prolonged confrontation. Soviet infantry, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns, launched repeated assaults across open terrain, often encountering well-prepared Hungarian positions reinforced by German units. The Hungarian 25th Infantry Division, fighting alongside German elements, held fortified lines that exploited the rolling hills and river crossings around the town. Soviet commanders reinforced the assault with the 4th Guards Rifle Division, while Romanian troops of the 18th Infantry Division attempted to flank the defenders. Casualties mounted rapidly on both sides, with village after village changing hands under heavy shelling and house-to-house combat. To the north, fighting also spread around Aiud and Târgu Mureș, where the Axis aimed to delay the advance by blowing up bridges and rail tracks. The Soviets, determined to maintain momentum, employed pontoon engineers and concentrated artillery barrages to force river crossings. Romanian units, operating on the flanks, played a crucial role in securing captured settlements and preventing counterattacks, though their limited armor left them vulnerable against German panzer groups. In several instances, Romanian infantry relied on close cooperation with Soviet T-34 units to hold ground after breakthroughs. The urban populations of these contested towns were caught in a cycle of bombardment, evacuation, and sudden occupation by alternating forces. Civilians sheltered in basements as artillery duels raged above. Municipal authorities often fled before advancing armies, leaving local populations to cope with shortages of food, water, and medical supplies. Refugee flows increased dramatically, with Hungarian families retreating westward toward Cluj and Hungarian-controlled areas, while Romanian civilians in occupied zones prepared for the return of Romanian administration. Reports of reprisals and summary executions emerged on both sides, adding to the atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Air power became a decisive factor during these early battles. The Soviet Fifth Air Army launched continuous sorties against Axis positions, targeting rail stations, convoys, and fortified centers. The Luftwaffe attempted to respond with fighter groups stationed in Hungary, but numerical inferiority limited its effectiveness. In several engagements, German Stuka dive bombers still managed to strike advancing Soviet columns, causing significant delays. Romanian air units, reorganized after the coup, provided limited support but were integrated under Soviet command and gradually expanded their role. By late September, Soviet and Romanian forces had made incremental gains but had not yet broken the Axis defensive network. At Turda, after 2 weeks of heavy combat, the front stabilized into a line of trenches and barricaded streets, with neither side able to claim decisive control. The attritional nature of these engagements highlighted the complexity of the campaign. The Soviets possessed superiority in manpower and equipment, but the defenders made skillful use of terrain, fortifications, and local counterattacks. For the Axis, however, the challenge remained one of time. Every day spent resisting in Northern Transylvania increased the risk of encirclement as Soviet and Romanian units pressed from multiple directions. The initial clashes around Turda, Aiud, and Târgu Mureș thus set the tone for the broader struggle for Cluj. They demonstrated both the determination of Axis forces to hold territory and the persistence of Soviet and Romanian armies in pushing westward. The outcome of these battles would determine whether the Axis could maintain a stable line in Transylvania or whether the Allies would open the way to the Hungarian plain. The fighting in northern Transylvania escalated sharply during the final week of September 1944. Both sides poured reinforcements into the contested sector, turning what had begun as probing attacks into a full-scale campaign. The Soviet Second Ukrainian Front transferred additional rifle divisions and tank brigades to the Cluj-Turda axis, while Romanian units stretched their lines to cover newly secured ground. On the Axis side, the German 8th Army redeployed elements of the 23rd Panzer Division and the 8th SS Cavalry Division, Florian Geyer, to bolster Hungarian infantry that had borne the brunt of the initial fighting. The Hungarian Second Army committed further reserves, including the 2nd Armored Division, which arrived with German-supplied Panzerfreifers and assault guns. The confrontation at Turda became the focal point of the campaign. From 22 to 30 September, successive Soviet and Romanian assaults attempted to breach the defensive arc encircling the town. Attacks often began with massive artillery barrages, followed by infantry advances supported by armor. The defenders responded with counter-battery fire and well-coordinated tank counterattacks, exploiting their knowledge of the terrain. German and Hungarian units established kill zones along narrow valleys, where advancing Soviet armor suffered heavy losses to concealed anti-tank guns. Despite these tactical successes, Axis troops faced relentless pressure, as Soviet formations could replace losses more readily and maintain the initiative. Romanian forces played an increasingly visible role in these operations. The Romanian 4th Army committed its 20th Infantry Division and elements of the 1st Cavalry Division, operating on the flanks of Soviet spearheads. Their tasks often included securing villages, protecting supply corridors, and consolidating captured ground after Soviet breakthroughs. In some engagements, Romanian troops fought independently, such as during the capture of hill positions overlooking the Turda Valley. Reports from the front indicated that Romanian units, though less well-equipped than their Soviet counterparts, displayed determination in reclaiming territory lost in 1940, while also sustaining heavy casualties from Axis counterattacks. The Axis command recognized that Cluj was the ultimate prize of the campaign, and therefore sought to delay the Soviet-Romanian advance for as long as possible. German intelligence reported that holding Transylvania into October would buy valuable time for strengthening defenses around Budapest. Consequently, the 23rd Panzer Division launched several counterstrokes aimed at cutting off Soviet spearheads advancing along the road network. On 23 September, German armored units struck near Luna, temporarily pushing back Soviet forces and recapturing several villages. Yet these gains proved short-lived, as Soviet reinforcements rapidly countered and forced the Germans back to their starting positions. Civilians in the contested areas faced dire conditions. Food supplies dwindled as military requisitions increased. Many villages were reduced to rubble by artillery exchanges, while towns such as Turda and Aiud became battlefields where civilians lived under constant bombardment. Both advancing and retreating forces pressed civilians into labor, repairing roads, building fieldworks, or transporting supplies. Refugees clogged every major road leading westward, while others attempted to remain in their homes despite the dangers. The human toll was not limited to destruction of property. Uncertainty about shifting authorities led to reprisals, arbitrary arrests, and fear of ethnic-based violence. By the end of September, casualty reports reflected the intensity of the struggle. Soviet and Romanian forces suffered thousands of losses in dead and wounded, with armored units particularly hard hit in repeated frontal assaults. Axis casualties were similarly severe, with Hungarian divisions reporting depleted ranks after weeks of continuous combat. Still, despite their losses, Axis units managed to hold much of their line around Turda and Cluj, frustrating Soviet hopes for a rapid breakthrough. The front had reached a crisis point. The Soviets sought to bring overwhelming strength to bear, while the Germans and Hungarians aimed to trade ground for time, resisting until a more defensible line could be established closer to Hungary's heartland. This stage of the campaign demonstrated the high cost of attrition warfare in Transylvania. Neither side achieved a decisive victory in September, but the escalating scale of operations foreshadowed even more destructive battles to come. The struggle for Cluj had become not only a contest for a strategic city, but also a measure of political will, testing the resolve of armies, governments, and populations caught in the shifting tides of the Eastern Front. By early October 1944, the campaign in Northern Transylvania reached its most intense phase. The battles around Turda, Aiud, and the approaches to Cluj had transformed into large-scale confrontations involving entire corps on both sides. Soviet forces concentrated their strength with the 27th Army and 6th Guards Tank Army driving toward Cluj from the southeast, while Romanian units advanced on the flanks to secure towns and villages. The Romanian 4th Army, with divisions such as the 20th Infantry and the 1st Cavalry, pressed toward the northern routes, aiming to block Axis withdrawals into Hungary. For the defenders, the German 8th Army and Hungarian 2nd Army received direct orders from Berlin and Budapest to hold Cluj as long as possible. The The German 23rd Panzer Division and Hungarian 2nd Armored Division, reinforced with assault guns and elements of SS cavalry units, formed the backbone of the defense. Despite shortages of fuel and ammunition, they launched repeated counterattacks, often with limited success but causing heavy Soviet and Romanian losses. The Hungarian 25th Infantry Division, entrenched in the hills surrounding Turda, resisted waves of assaults, supported by German artillery positioned on high ground. The scale of operations placed immense pressure on logistics. Soviet supply columns stretched back across the Carpathians, relying on hastily repaired railways and congested roads. Fuel shortages sometimes slowed tank advances, forcing units to pause and regroup. Romanian formations faced similar problems, often relying on captured equipment or Soviet supplies. Axis logistics were equally strained. Allied air superiority disrupted German and Hungarian rail transport, while fuel deliveries from Hungary struggled to keep pace with the tempo of battle. In many cases, German and Hungarian units resorted to rationing artillery ammunition and relying on field fortifications to conserve resources. Civilian life in and around Cluj was transformed by the scale of the fighting. Air raids struck the city, targeting railway yards and military depots, while artillery shells fell into residential districts. Thousands of inhabitants fled westward toward Hungarian-controlled areas, while others remained in shelters, attempting to preserve what little property they could. The presence of multiple armies brought waves of requisitions. Livestock, carts, and buildings were commandeered for military use. Civilians also faced reprisals as authorities sought to root out suspected collaborators on both sides. For many families, the shifting front lines meant repeated changes in control, each accompanied by new sets of demands and fears. By the first week of October, the Soviet and Romanian offensive reached its peak intensity. The 6th Guards Tank Army launched a concentrated assault on Axis lines east of Cluj, supported by massive artillery fire. Romanian divisions attempted to envelop the defenders from the south, while Soviet infantry advanced directly toward the city. Axis commanders responded with their last reserves, committing armored groups to counterattacks in the valleys and deploying all available artillery. Casualty figures on both sides soared. Thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded in engagements fought over villages, bridges, and ridgelines that changed hands multiple times in a single day. The struggle for Cluj had become a battle of endurance. The Soviets and Romanians sought to maintain pressure until Axis lines collapsed, while German and Hungarian commanders aimed to extract their forces gradually toward the Hungarian plain, without disintegration. The outcome would determine not only control of Northern Transylvania, but also the tempo of the Red Army's advance into Central Europe. In the meantime, soldiers and civilians alike endured one of the bloodiest phases of the Transylvanian campaign. As the front lines hardened around Cluj in the second week of October 1944, both sides sought ways to adapt to the brutal conditions of the campaign. For the Soviets and Romanians, the initial expectation of a swift breakthrough had given way to a recognition that the Axis was determined to resist at almost every crossing and ridge. Commanders shifted tactics from direct frontal assaults to encirclement maneuvers, attempting to exploit weaknesses in the German-Hungarian defensive arc. Reconnaissance units scouted mountain passes and river valleys, searching for routes that could bypass heavily fortified zones. Artillery concentrations were redirected to methodically dismantle strongpoints rather than simply prepare for massed infantry charges. Romanian divisions, though lacking modern tanks and heavy artillery, compensated by using their detailed knowledge of the terrain. Infantry units advanced through forested hills to threaten Axis flanks, while cavalry detachments patrolled secondary roads to cut off supply convoys. Romanian commanders emphasized flexibility, often coordinating with Soviet tank brigades that provided the striking power needed for deeper penetrations. Cooperation was not always smooth. Soviet officers occasionally criticized Romanian units for advancing too cautiously, while Romanian officers noted that Soviet spearheads sometimes left their flanks exposed. Yet the shared objective of capturing Cluj gradually pushed both armies toward greater coordination. On the Axis side, adaptation took the form of counterattacks and tactical withdrawals designed to preserve combat strength. The German 23rd Panzer Division, despite fuel shortages, continued to mount limited armored thrusts against advancing Soviet infantry, forcing them to slow their tempo. Hungarian infantry divisions reinforced village defenses with improvised barricades and minefields, making every street and bridge a contested space. Axis engineers also destroyed key infrastructure, including railway junctions and bridges across the Someș River, to delay the Soviet approach. These actions, though effective in the short term, also increased civilian suffering by disrupting local supply systems and isolating communities. Partisan activity, though less decisive than on other fronts, added another layer to the conflict. Groups of local resistance fighters, often aligned with either Romanian or Soviet authorities, sabotaged Axis communication lines and provided intelligence about troop movements. In response, German and Hungarian security units carried out harsh reprisals, arresting suspected collaborators and imposing strict curfews. For civilians, the presence of partisans was both a source of hope and a cause of danger, as villages suspected of aiding resistance fighters could face collective punishment. Morale fluctuated sharply. Among Soviet troops, confidence in eventual victory remained high, bolstered by constant reinforcements and air support. Romanian soldiers, motivated by the prospect of reclaiming Transylvania, often fought with determination, but struggled under heavy losses. On the Axis side, morale was strained but not broken. German officers stressed the strategic necessity of delaying the Red Army at Cluj, while Hungarian soldiers viewed the defense of Transylvania as a fight for their homeland. Propaganda circulated in trenches and civilian centers alike, each side promising that endurance would bring eventual triumph. The psychological toll of the campaign grew heavier with each passing week. Continuous artillery bombardments, ruined villages, and mounting casualties left soldiers exhausted and civilians traumatized. Reports from field hospitals described overcrowded wards and shortages of medical supplies, with both Soviet and Axis surgeons performing operations under improvised conditions. Letters from soldiers at the front reflected fatigue and uncertainty, yet also a grim determination to continue. By mid-October, it was evident that both sides had adapted their strategies to the protracted struggle. The Soviets and Romanians pursued envelopment and attrition, while the Germans and Hungarians fought delaying battles, retreating only when compelled by overwhelming pressure. The campaign was entering a phase where the next decisive movement, a breakthrough or a collapse, could alter the balance not only in Northern Transylvania, but across all of Central Europe. The second half of October 1944 marked the decisive turning point of the campaign for Northern Transylvania. After weeks of heavy fighting, Soviet and Romanian commanders concentrated their efforts on breaking the Axis hold on Cluj, the principal objective of the operation. The 27th Army, reinforced with additional rifle divisions, prepared a broad offensive along the Someș Valley, while the 6th Guards Tank Army massed armored forces for a breakthrough west of Turda. On the southern flank, Romanian divisions pressed forward through the Apuseni foothills, aiming to envelop the city from multiple directions. Axis commanders recognized that their position was becoming untenable. The German 8th Army and Hungarian 2nd Army had suffered severe losses in men and materiel during the September battles. Though reinforced with smaller detachments from the 3rd Hungarian Army, their effective strength had been reduced to less than 2/3 of the initial force. Fuel shortages crippled the 23rd Panzer Division, limiting its mobility, while Hungarian infantry divisions reported declining morale and exhaustion. Still, Hitler's directives and Budapest's political determination demanded that Cluj be held for as long as possible, both to preserve Hungarian claims to the region and to delay the Red Army's entry into the Hungarian plain. The Soviet offensive commenced in the 3rd week of October with a massive artillery preparation. Hundreds of guns, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers saturated Axis positions along the approaches to Cluj. Entire villages were engulfed in fire as Soviet infantry advanced behind rolling barrages. Romanian troops moved simultaneously on the flanks, engaging in close quarters, fighting to secure ridgelines and forested hills that overlooked Axis defensive belts. The Axis responded with counterattacks, but their depleted tank reserves could not match the numerical superiority of the Soviet armor. Several engagements saw Panzer Division and Stu-3 assault guns, attempting to blunt the Soviet T-34 spearheads, often destroying significant numbers but at the cost of irreplaceable vehicles and crews. Urban combat flared in the outskirts of Cluj by 23 October. Soviet rifle regiments entered eastern suburbs, encountering barricades, fortified houses, and sniper fire. Romanian detachments engaged in bitter street fighting in nearby villages such as Florești and Băuţ, gradually tightening the ring around the city. The defenders, consisting of mixed German-Hungarian units, utilized every available building for cover, turning the advance into a slow, casualty-heavy process. Both sides committed engineers to clear mines and demolish barricades, while artillery fire reduced entire districts to rubble. Civilians inside Cluj endured some of the harshest conditions of the campaign. Food shortages reached critical levels, and many families lived underground in cellars or improvised shelters. The constant shifting of authority caused widespread fear. Hungarian residents feared reprisals once Romanian and Soviet troops entered, while Romanian families hoped for reunification, but faced the dangers of bombardment and military occupation. Churches, schools, and hospitals were turned into field stations, though medical supplies were grossly insufficient for the numbers of wounded soldiers and civilians. The turning point came as Soviet forces, supported by Romanian infantry, succeeded in breaking through the Axis defensive arc north of the city. On 24–25 October, the 6th Guards Tank Army advanced rapidly, threatening to encircle German and Hungarian positions. Recognizing the danger of encirclement, General Otto Wöhler ordered a general withdrawal westward, seeking to preserve what remained of his forces for the defense of Hungary itself. Hungarian commanders reluctantly complied, aware that continued resistance inside Cluj risked the destruction of entire divisions. By 25 October, Soviet and Romanian units entered Cluj in force, securing the city after days of combat. Axis troops retreated towards Zalo and Oradea, leaving behind destroyed equipment, abandoned ammunition dumps, and devastated urban districts. Romanian authorities quickly re-established administrative control, raising the Romanian flag over government buildings. For Bucharest, the liberation of Cluj represented both a symbolic and strategic victory, confirming Romania's reversal of alliances and bolstering its claims to Northern Transylvania. The capture of Cluj marked the collapse of Axis resistance in the region. Though German and Hungarian units continued to fight delaying actions west of the city, the momentum had shifted decisively. The Soviet and Romanian armies had achieved their goal, opening the road into Hungary and securing the return of Northern Transylvania. Yet the cost was immense. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians had been killed or wounded. Towns and villages lay in ruins, and the landscape bore the scars of one of the bloodiest campaigns fought on Romanian soil. The fall of Cluj in late October 1944 did not immediately end the fighting in northern Transylvania. Although the city itself was secured, German and Hungarian forces carried out a series of rearguard actions as they retreated westward toward the Hungarian plain. Their objective was to slow the Soviet and Romanian pursuit long enough to reorganize defensive lines along the border regions of eastern Hungary. These withdrawals were carried out under constant pressure, with Soviet armored spearheads attempting to cut off escape routes and Romanian infantry pressing closely behind. Skirmishes erupted in the countryside around Zalo, Oradea, and Satu Mare, where Axis units established temporary blocking positions before retreating further. The withdrawal placed enormous strain on Axis forces. The German 23rd Panzer Division, already depleted, left behind many of its damaged vehicles, destroying them to prevent capture. Hungarian infantry divisions, weakened by continuous combat, often lacked sufficient transport and had to retreat on foot. Morale among Hungarian troops declined, as reports spread that large parts of Transylvania were being lost permanently. German officers, intent on preserving combat effectiveness, enforced strict discipline during the retreat, but desertions and straggling became increasingly common. For Soviet and Romanian forces, the aftermath of victory in Cluj presented both opportunities and challenges. The Soviets pushed forward aggressively, aiming to cross into Hungary and exploit the weakened state of Axis defenses. The Romanian Fourth Army, encouraged by the symbolic liberation of Cluj, advanced westward with determination, though it faced persistent logistical problems. Supply lines stretched thin, and equipment losses during September and October left some Romanian divisions with reduced fighting capacity. Nonetheless, the joint advance continued, coordinated under Soviet high command. Civilians in Northern Transylvania experienced profound upheaval in these weeks. The entry of Soviet and Romanian troops was accompanied by the re-establishment of Romanian administration, reversing 4 years of Hungarian control. Romanian communities greeted the change with relief, but Hungarian families often faced reprisals, confiscations, or expulsions. In several towns, acts of violence occurred as local grievances, stoked by years of propaganda and shifting loyalties, came to the surface. Soviet military authorities attempted to enforce order, but also carried out requisitions and imposed strict controls, adding to the burden on local populations. Infrastructure across the region lay in ruins. Railways had been torn apart by demolitions, bridges destroyed in retreat, and factories stripped of machinery. Towns such as Turda, Aiud, and Cluj bore the scars of prolonged bombardment. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and civilians, many of whom could not be adequately treated due to shortages of medical supplies. Refugees who had fled earlier in the campaign began to return to shattered homes, often finding little left to salvage. The humanitarian crisis deepened as winter approached, with shelter, food, and fuel in dangerously short supply. Politically, the capture of Northern Transylvania solidified Romania's new position within the Allied camp. On 25 October, later celebrated as Romania's Day of the Army, official declarations emphasized the liberation of Cluj as proof of Romania's loyalty to the Allied cause. For the Soviet Union, the victory secured a strategic base for launching the next phase of operations into Hungary. Meanwhile, for Germany and Hungary, the loss of Transylvania represented a major setback, signaling the shrinking of Axis-controlled Europe and the encroachment of the Red Army into Central Europe's core territories. By early November, the front had shifted westward, leaving behind a devastated region. Combat operations in Northern Transylvania diminished, replaced by the practical tasks of rebuilding, re-establishing authority, and integrating the territory back under Romanian control. Yet the memory of the fighting remained vivid among soldiers and civilians alike. For many communities, the battles of September and October 1944 represented not only a military campaign, but also a moment of profound political transformation, ending one occupation while ushering in another. Thus, the withdrawal and aftermath closed the military chapter of the Transylvanian campaign, even as it opened new questions about the region's post-war fate. The struggle for Cluj and its surrounding territories had ended in Allied victory, but its human and material costs would shape local life long after the guns fell silent. The conclusion of the Transylvanian campaign in the autumn of 1944 left a legacy that extended far beyond the battlefields themselves. Militarily, the Soviet and Romanian capture of Cluj and the surrounding territories marked a decisive step in the collapse of German and Hungarian control in Eastern Europe. It opened the pathway into Hungary, where subsequent battles around Debrecen and later Budapest would determine the future of Central Europe. Strategically, the victory demonstrated the capacity of the Red Army, in coordination with Allied forces, to conduct large-scale offensives that combined maneuver warfare, attrition, and political realignment of former Axis partners. For Romania, the outcome carried immense national and political significance. The return of Northern Transylvania, lost under the Second Vienna Award of 1940, symbolized the restoration of territorial integrity. The liberation of Cluj on 25 October was enshrined in national memory as a day of military and political vindication. Romanian troops, who had fought first alongside Germany and then against it, were now presented as having contributed decisively to the defeat of the Axis in southeastern Europe. This shift strengthened the position of King Michael I and his government, though it also bound Romania firmly to the Soviet sphere of influence, a reality that would define its post-war trajectory. For Hungary, the loss of Northern Transylvania represented both a military defeat and a profound political blow. The region had been granted under Axis arbitration in 1940 and served as a cornerstone of Hungarian national claims. Its recapture by Romania, supported by Soviet arms, fueled a sense of betrayal and desperation in Budapest. Regent Miklós Horthy attempted to negotiate Hungary's exit from the war in October 1944, but his efforts failed under German pressure, leading to the installation of the Arrow Cross regime. The battles in Transylvania thus directly influenced Hungary's political collapse and deepened its dependence on Germany, even as defeat loomed. Germany's military position in southeastern Europe deteriorated irreversibly as a result of the campaign. The Wehrmacht lost access to key defensive terrain in the Carpathians and was forced into costly retreats. The failure to hold Cluj undermined Hitler's plans to maintain a solid southeastern front, and the diversion of German divisions to defend Transylvania weakened efforts elsewhere. By November 1944, Germany faced simultaneous crises in Poland, the Balkans, and Hungary, accelerating the overall decline of its war effort. For the Soviet Union, the victory had both immediate and long-term importance. In the short term, it secured a direct route into the Hungarian plain, paving the way for the Budapest offensive launched later that year. In the longer term, it consolidated Soviet influence over Romania and laid the groundwork for post-war political restructuring. The Red Army's presence in Northern Transylvania, coupled with its role in the region's liberation, was invoked after 1945 to justify the establishment of pro-Soviet regimes in Bucharest and beyond. The civilian population of Northern Transylvania bore lasting scars from the campaign. Thousands were displaced, homes and infrastructure lay in ruins, and ethnic tensions deepened in the wake of changing borders. Romanian communities viewed the outcome as liberation, while Hungarian families experienced it as loss. The coexistence of these groups, already fragile, was tested further by reprisals, population movements, and political realignments in the years that followed. The war left not only physical devastation, but also divisions that would influence interethnic relations throughout the second half of the 20th century. In historical memory, the battles of September and October 1944 became layered with symbolism. In Romania, the recapture of Cluj was celebrated as the culmination of national sacrifice and the turning of the army against its former Axis partners. In Hungary, it was remembered as a tragic reversal, tied to the broader story of territorial losses after the Second World War. Soviet accounts emphasized the role of the Red Army as liberator, framing the campaign as part of the inexorable march toward Berlin. Western historians later interpreted the events as a case study in the complexities of alliance politics, shifting loyalties, and the interplay between military campaigns and political settlements. The legacy of Bloody Cluj lies in its demonstration of how local battles could shape continental outcomes. The campaign altered borders, redefined alliances, and accelerated the collapse of the Axis in Central Europe. It left behind destroyed cities, fractured communities, and a memory contested by different nations. Yet it also underscored the decisive nature of the Eastern Front in the final phase of the war, where the outcome of regional struggles determined the shape of Europe after 1945. The story of Northern Transylvania in 1944 remains, therefore, not only a chronicle of military operations, but also a reminder of the war's enduring impact on politics, societies, and identities across the region.